Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to another edition of The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime in all of its forms, but especially La Cosa Nostra. I will tell you, I have done a lot of podcast interviews over the years. I have given interviews on every subject, mostly about radio or politics, but yeah, a lot of interviews about the mob and about the crime situation in general, all sorts of things, Star Trek, even you name it, I've done an interview with somebody on it. And I have to be honest with you, I, in my life, have never gotten a reaction like the one that I received when I was a guest on the Sitdown. I heard from people that I hadn't heard from in years in awe of the fact that I was on the Sitdown. I heard from people that I serve on the community board with who had no interest, no care about the fact that I've been on radio for 20 years, but they came up to me wanting to hear the incredible true story of how I got on the Sitdown. If you're not familiar with the Sitdown, you're in luck, because you're about to be. The Sitdown is a crime history podcast, but its host, Jeff Nadu, has been able to incredibly merge the worlds of new media and old school newspaper junkies. He's been able to get kind of the kinds of folks that might never open a newspaper on the same page as these grizzled gangsters who all await each edition of his podcast, because honestly, it has probably become the go-to source of current event information for all things related to gangland. I am thrilled to welcome back to the program the one and only Jeff Nadu. Jeff, it's great to talk to you again, my friend.
Frank, thank you, man. That's very nice of you. I'm glad you got a good reaction. We had a good reaction from you coming on. It's always good to have various people such as yourself to come on and chat about the world of organized and disorganized crime. Thank you for having me yet again. I always like talking to you. You know, it's so funny because we did the interview. We spoke about a bunch of things, including the Gaudis, and you promoted that I was coming on. And I heard from several members of the Gaudi family and others close to the Gaudis saying, right, I can't believe you would go on with Jeff Nadu. Have you heard the kind of things he says about blank? And I said, well, look, I thought it was a very fair interview, and hopefully after you watch it, you'll think the same thing. And then afterwards, I heard from almost all those same people saying, I got to admit, that was actually a pretty good interview. So even a lot of your critics, your normal critics, at least in Gaudi world, they gave you a pretty strong grade for at least our discussion. Hey, but for people that aren't familiar with you or your history, Jeff, give us a little bit of a background. How did you get to be such an expert in the field of organized crime? Yeah, so as you said, my name is Jeff Nadu. I do a show called The Sitdown. Honestly, Frank, I'd always been interested in the mafia. I've always been interested in organized crime. I come from a world of sports and media, and I've worked at big media companies, and I always wanted to kind of start a show that took me away from sports a little bit. And I always had an interest in the films and stuff like that. And I thought, you know what, let me start this podcast, see how it does, and go from there. And
people took to it. I always felt like I had good content. I always put out good stories, and I wanted to tell the stories of the people that, maybe, it's cool to learn about John Gotti and Vinny Gigante, but, I wanted to tell the stories of the other people and kind of tell the story of a group that, is maligned and was very powerful at one point, and maybe isn't anymore. But, it's taken me a different way in life, and, I'm here for it.
That's for sure. One of the things that I've found in trying to do this podcast specifically about the mob is it's challenging a lot of the time to get news, because a lot of the sources, especially sources outside of law enforcement that have a lot of the information that I'm looking for, what's going on in the world of the organized crime business, who is rumored to be flipping, who's rumored to be getting indicted, all sorts of things like that. A lot of them don't want to speak. And certainly if they do speak, they want to do it on. I'm curious, without, revealing too many of your secrets, how do you do such a good job keeping up with the news? Tell me how your sourcing works. Who are the kind of folks that you're speaking to on a regular basis? Because I could tell in watching your podcast, which people could check out on the YouTube, you are real up to date, and it seems like you have some pretty informed sources.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, I think, as you always have to kind of go to the face of where you are, and I try to do that. I try to make connections with people that maybe live in these neighborhoods, people that were a part of this cohort at one point, maybe aren't anymore. I mean, Frank, you would be surprised at how many of these guys that were maybe looked at as let's say, an informant, how much they still know about the streets. And a lot of it's just background information. Tell me about this guy. Have you ever heard of this guy? Do you ever remember this guy, what he was doing? And then, again, I still talk to people that are in that life currently, people that don't want to necessarily be mentioned, guys that, maybe have a coffee shop or a bar, or they still live in Bensonhurst or somewhere in Staten Island. And I just try to, if I know I'm going to be talking about a particular person or a particular event, I try to find maybe, someone that's lived in that area for 50 years or, again, someone that was involved directly. Nowadays, it's, again, all about who you know, and you build a group of people over the years. I've been doing this going over 3 years now. So I think by this point, if I haven't met the right people, I guess I probably wouldn't be doing the right thing. Plus, a lot of this stuff, Frank, you can find, for instance, there was a guy recently that died. He was hit by a DOT vehicle in Brooklyn. He was an old Genovese member. Just looking through old indictments about his background, who he was, that can really give you a lot of info as well. So, again, connections are important, but, again, it's looking back into old shows that I did and remembering names and looking through indictments, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and what I can tell in watching your podcast is the amount of work that you do in exactly what you described, the minutia, the tedious aspect of things that aren't glamorous, things that don't necessarily, that people don't make movies about, which is basically reading through old paperwork and old criminal cases, which is something that a lot of people, even in journalism, don't necessarily want to seem to do the work about these days. Hey, let me ask you, we're seeing a lot of news for some reason, can't figure out why, about Donald Trump these days. He looks like he's at least has a better than even chance at going back to the White House. Donald Trump has been talked about in some mob circles from time to time. Obviously, coming up in the New York construction business, there's going to be all sorts of areas where you cross swords with certain organized crime figures. His attorney was Roy Cohen, who, in addition to representing John Gotti, represented Tony Salerno and some other organized crime figures. And he's been talked about from time to time as having a relationship with various organized crime figures. I'm sure you've been asked the question before. What, based on what you're aware of, what history does Donald Trump have with the mob and with prominent organized crime figures?
I wouldn't say he has particular strong, affiliation. No real difference than any other person that was, in the construction road. As you know, in the 80s, I mean, Donald Trump was part of building, Trump Tower and things like that. And look, to deal with construction, you had to go through the mob. You had to work through, Union 282, some of the concrete unions, that sort of thing. Which, again, if you were doing that, you did. Now, Philadelphia, I think, is a little bit more interesting. When Trump was building the Trump Casino in Atlantic City, there was a piece of land that he was looking for to build parking on. And it was, I want to say on Pacific Avenue, and it belonged to a guy called Philip Testa. He had been killed in the early 80s.
The Chicken Man.
The Chicken Man, correct. And his son, Nicodemo Scarfo, took that over. And he, throughout the family, he had to buy it off Trump, and Trump actually gave him significantly less than he should have, and kind of made a deal. He probably should have got it for like $3 million, but the Testas ended up selling it for like $1.5 million. And he had commented to his people that he probably got it cheaper than he should have, and he just kind of did it through shell companies. But I wouldn't say there's really a connection there. I know his father knew people in the mafia, and his father told him to stay out of that circle because his father was told by guys in the Genovese family that your son will never make it because he's not like us. He's gonna have to deal with people like us, and he's not built like that. There was also some connections with the Colombo crime family in the late 80s, involving a licensing deal with a limo rental company that was owned by a Colombo crime family member. But outside of that, nothing. Really, I mean, I'm probably more connected to the mob than Donald Trump is.
Well, good. I'm glad I asked you that because that's one of the things that a lot of Trump's critics will bring up from time to time. So I'm glad we could get that.
Frank, at the end of the day, though, I mean, just because you talk to somebody or maybe you had to work with them and get some concrete from. Look, every concrete company was controlled by the mob. They controlled every price on a yard of concrete from wherever to wherever. So if they were to bring that up, and look, I've heard people recently compare him to John Gotti, with the Teflon Don stuff, and it's really just names.
Let's talk about this latest mob indictment. This one brought by the New York State Attorney General Letitia James appears to be mostly gambling related, but does involve several members of the Gambino crime family, the Bonanno crime family. They say it was a $22 million illegal gambling ring. What can you tell us about it, Jeff?
Yeah, this is actually, Frank, when you look at kind of an indictment, $22 million between essentially a 6-month period is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of wagers coming in. That's not $50 and $100 gamblers, in Brooklyn or something. This is big money that's coming in. And look, this is all, very what they would call a popcorn headline case. I think a lot of people would look at Letitia James and say, why aren't you focused on, some of the real violent crime that's going on? This is a family-like affair, literally and figuratively. It is the Gambino crime family, but it's families within families. A group called the LaForte family. They go pretty way back in Staten Island. But what I think it also did is it showed us that the family is still alive and well. They're making younger members. They have guys in their 40s that are being made. This is still a group that makes a lot of money. And this isn't the only indictment involving the Gambinos over the last, say, 5 years. I think the goal for these people, though, is to stay out of the violent crime indictments, the murders, that sort of thing. Look, you may have to do a couple of years for gambling or loan sharking, but in a long-term affair, it's not going to hurt you. Now, some of the people arrested were, I guess, interesting, I guess you can say, but not any huge names. Really, again, a popcorn headline kind of case. A lot of these people will cop to pleas and get a year or two.
It's interesting that you framed it that way, that it's not necessarily going to make or break any sort of crime entity. And I'm going to ask you about what the status of the mafia is these days and the organized crime families involved in these indictments. But in terms of the implications for the Gambino and the Bonanno crime families specifically, this isn't the type of case where the people indicted are facing such lengthy prison sentences that it's going to lead to a domino effect of people flipping, right?
No. Again, it's really just about staying away from those long prison sentences. Now, again, there have been indictments over the last 5 years involving members of this family that are more serious. I mentioned the LaForte family. There are two other members of the LaForte family that are involved in a much more serious case out of Philadelphia, New York, involving a company called Par Funding. Now, some of the charges in that are a little bit more serious, but no, again, if you're looking at bookmaking, loan sharking, those kind of charges, a lot of the times you're going to cop out, get 12, 24, 36 months, and, you're going to be away from your family for a little bit, but it's better than getting a 10, 20-year sentence. You're not going to change your life over that. To me, it's more interesting about just reading into some of the people arrested, finding out that a person that was 40 years old was arrested. He was a recent made member of the family, kind of looking into some of these younger people. Just shows me that these families are still, at least some of them, alive and well.
So let's talk about that. And I was going to get to that a little bit later, but since you went there, let's go there now. What is the status of these mob families these days? One of the things, that's a question that I often get, is how big of a deal is the mob these days? Give me your take on where we are.
Well, the mob on a criminal totem pole in New York is quite small, right? It's low. They're not going to have the influence they once had over unions and construction and extortion and things like that. But now a lot of the people that are becoming made members are earners, right? There is a no-kill order. Nobody's dying in the mafia anymore, and that is one thing that I think hurts those groups because they can't kind of flex their muscles like they used to. But nowadays, you're not going to be a made member of the mob unless you're an earner who can make a lot of money. Most of the families, in fact, all five of the families are still around. Some of them are weaker than others. Some are making new members. Some aren't. Some have strong hierarchies. Some don't. But it's make money, not headlines. They don't want to be out there on front page news like the 80s or 90s. They don't want to be out there in $2,000 suits. That's not the mafia today. If I showed you a mobster, a lot of the time they would just blend right into everyone else at a kid's soccer game or at a restaurant. They're not out there. And again, some of them have long histories and you know who they are. But I think a lot of the old guys are just kind of retiring, taking the money they have and maybe putting some of the control into maybe a son's hand or a nephew's hand. And they're trying to get a little younger.
Is being in the mob still a lucrative business proposition?
That's an interesting question. I'm fascinated by that because I was asked recently by someone kind of similar in a media role, what would be the benefit to join the mafia today? Because you're not going to get the same, perks, let's say you had when it was the 70s or 80s. I think a lot of the time it's just about being a part of something, having certain security in certain neighborhoods and saying, hey, I'm with this guy, I'm with that guy. Again, the mafia doesn't mean much in middle America or even outside of the New York area, but in, let's say, a Bensonhurst or a Staten Island or a North Jersey, some of those neighborhoods are still controlled by the mob. They still hold weight, and people want the respect of being part of that organization. You're part of something. You can, be a part of something bigger. And I think that's what some of the draw is. Now, I never understood it, Frank. If I have a car dealership and I'm making $5 million a month, why I would want to share 10, 20% with somebody doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But, again, for some of these people in some of these neighborhoods, it's an important flag to have.
Yeah, that is for sure. You alluded to some of the mafia family structures having more strictly delineated hierarchies than others. I remember there seemed to be a movement towards more ruling panels rather than one guy as the top boss. Is that something that is still in existence in any of the mob families that we hear about these days, or is the more old school structure of a boss, underboss, consigliere, has that made more of a comeback?
I think in most families, it's either that or, front bosses, or we don't know who the boss is. There's several names that you'll hear. There for years, we don't know who the boss of the Genovese crime family is. It might be this guy, it might be that guy. And really, since Chin Gigante died in the mid-2000s, it's really been a question of, is it a younger guy? Yeah, I think, at least to me it is. I think that's the best way to do it. Having a dictated boss, underboss, consigliere, and captains, you kind of put people out there in front of everything. I think it's more just about the right people know who's in control, and that's all that matters. It's not as pronounced. But, yeah, I think in some cases, some of the hierarchies are in prison, right? And there's acting bosses. I mean, you look at the Lucchese crime family. The still official boss of that family is Victor Amuso. And until Victor Amuso dies, he'll be the boss of that family. Now, on the streets, there's a street boss. And there's someone that makes the decisions on the street. But you're never going to take Vic Amuso down. You're only going to wait for him to die. And when he dies, then you'll insert someone else. But you want to keep the heat off yourself, and who better to put it on than a guy who's already serving life and never getting out?
Yeah, we're talking to Jeff Nadu. He's the host of the Sitdown, a crime history podcast and a crime current events podcast, which you absolutely have to check out. Jeff, who do you read or listen to get your news about the mob? Beyond reading primary sources like indictments and things of that sort, who do you turn to for analysis, commentary, and news about the mob?
Well, look, I mean, I think, Frank, obviously a guy like Tapishi is still pronounced in this genre, right? He still has Gangland News. He's still kind of the go-to guy, when it comes to... Are
you friendly with Jerry?
I've never talked to Jerry. I know that I believe that he knows that my show exists, but I've learned with some of the older guys, they're not really big on communicating with some of the younger guys. They just kind of do their thing and that's it. I do know that, Jerry only puts out a column every week or every 2 weeks. And, there are times where I'll get to news before him and so on. But I would say, mob news today is tough just because there isn't much of it.
Right.
A lot of the time someone will, whether it's a lawyer or somebody in the streets, they'll contact me and say, hey, did you hear about this? And I'll look into it. But no, I can't say outside of my own content that I do, I don't really consume a lot of it. I'm getting to the point where I have interest in other things, and I look into that. And there's just not much news to really delve into anyway. But there's a couple of channels I like and a couple of people I read like Jerry. And sometimes he'll get news that nobody has.
Yeah. It's funny. He had an item about Joe C., Joseph Caridi, who some people refer to as the Tony Soprano of the Lucchese family, who just passed away. Yeah. What can you tell us about Joe C., Joseph Caridi? First of all, is that really something that anybody ever actually called him, the Tony Soprano of the Lucchese family?
No. And I think there's one thing about nicknames I've learned over the years with mobsters is a lot of the time they're just made by the FBI or the newspaper.
Exactly. I've known who Joseph Caridi is for 20 years. I've never heard anybody once refer to him as the Tony Soprano of the Lucchese family.
It'll sell papers and stuff, but I talked to someone that was related to Stephen Crea at one point, and he said to me, I don't know where they got this nickname Wonder Boy. No one's ever called them that. And I've learned that a lot of the time gangsters have nicknames between themselves, and no one walked up to John Gotti and said, hey, Dapper Don, I can't wait to have dinner tonight, so it didn't really work like that. I actually came across Joseph Caridi. I mean, I've known about him for years, but I interviewed a guy called Louis Kasman.
Oh, sure.
A month
I know
or so
Louis
ago,
Kasman.
And Louis actually was shaking down a bar called Hudson and McCoy out on Long Island, and Caridi was called to kind of help the owner get his club back, and his name had popped up there. But outside of that, I can't say I've ever heard that nickname. And I know John Panisi's mentioned him, and I heard kind of him mentioned. Obviously that family's out of Brooklyn, and there's a lot of Brooklyn guys. He was a Brooklyn guy, I believe. One point he was part of the Bonanno family, and then moved over to the Lucchese. But yeah, I've never heard that nickname.
In terms of one other item that Jerry had was John Regano and a naked cooperating witness. Apparently that case is going to be able to go forward. What can you tell folks about that case?
Yeah, so he's actually, he was indicted back in late, I want to say 2021, involving the Colombo Bonanno family. John Regano is a Bonanno Maid member, but he is essentially a loan shark guy. He's from Queens. He's shaked people down for years. He's always trying to collect on extortionate means. And a lot of the people that were involved in that original indictment, they've all pled out for the most part. They've either pled out and are in prison or have died, like a Mush Russo. There have been other people involved in that case, one of which, a guy called Richard Ferrara, he's cooperated over, I think, 5 years. So he's been feeding the government some information. And John Regano was involved with not only, I believe, extortion, but also some sort of safety school where he was shaking a union down on Long Island for OSHA licenses or something. And yeah, this victim, I guess he wrote some quotes talking about he owed him money and, let's see how you're going to do when I get out of prison, that sort of thing. He'll slap him around. And that's the kind of stuff, if you're a mob guy, you can't have being said on tape because that's assault. That's assaulting a federal witness. And that's what's going to bring, more long-standing prison sentences.
So I know you said most of the other guys in that case pled out. Do you see this Regano case actually going to trial?
Yeah, I would think. I think as far as I know, I think it is going to go to trial.
Yeah, well, as of now it is, but it's just, these mob trials, and I say this as having covered a good number of them, just so rare these days.
Yeah, I mean, going to trial is definitely a real, I think, obviously, taking a real shot. I mean, I think if the government presents him with a deal, he'll be willing to take it. I don't know who his lawyer is. I haven't heard much. I know Gene Borrello, has mentioned this guy to me, Regano, and that he's a bit of a lunatic. And I think he came up around Vinny Asaro, and, he was in the kind of the Ozone Park, Howard Beach group. I don't know. Some of these guys that don't take pleas, Frank, there's old school guys that they won't take a plea ever, and they'll die in prison because they won't take pleas.
One of the things that I enjoy about your YouTube channel is you do a lot of great on-demand content, and people can search it, the Sit-Down with Jeff Nadu. Oh, and you also do some live YouTube telecasts from time to time. Tell folks about the difference in the kind of content that you're commenting on and that you're putting out there when you're doing the on-demand stuff versus when you do live stuff. What do you choose to focus on in each of those platforms?
Yeah, I think, when I release a video, I mean, that's kind of more of a release type of thing. It's going to come out 2 times a week, and it's something that I spend a bunch of time on. Lives are more of a way for me to just kind of communicate with my audience, take questions, speak to people, speak to the audience. So it's a little bit different form. I will say over the years that it's probably been one of my downfalls, I think you can say, because again, you take different stuff. You have to deal with the audience directly. When you release a video, you just people listen to it and they either like it or they don't like it. You face a direct, kind of group where you have to deal with them kind of head on. So, they've been fun over the years. They've also been a bit of a headache, but I try to offer everything because I want to communicate with the audience, and it allows people to donate to the channel or support the channel or whatever they want to do.
Absolutely. Hey, what did I hear about your future on the YouTube? It kind of sounded in your last live video like you may be making alternative plans. What's going on? Set us straight.
Yeah, I'm coming up on, 3 years doing this. And, I always felt like, to me, every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I feel like there are times where I'll wake up, Frank, and I'll think, can I sustain this for 5, 10, 50? Can I do this long term? Do I want to just do videos on YouTube for the rest of my life? And it's, as you know, this isn't a particularly newsworthy. I mean, the mafia isn't making news like they used to.
Right.
Look at
it's not like covering the Mets where there's a game every day. Yeah.
No. And as you know, my first kind of passion has always been sports. And there are days where I wake up and I don't want to. I want to cover other crime. I want to talk about cartels. That's stuff that I really enjoy doing. And, I guess sometimes you back yourself into just having to talk about the mafia. And I get to the point where I kind of just want to talk about other things.
But what's stopping you on the existing channel that you have from commenting on those other things as well?
Well, because the channel is so mob-centric. It always has been. And that I've tried, going into other content, and people just want to hear about the mafia. And I've also gotten to the point where, this genre is drama-filled too, where you have a lot of people that they want the fights with creators. They want to see the informants fighting each other. They like that sort of thing. And reality TV, as you know, is very popular. People like the fighting and all that sort of thing. And I guess, I've tried doing other content, and it's just not receptive as well, just because people like mob content. And if you're not talking about John Gotti or Joey Merlino, it's just not going to get as many eyes. But I don't know. I guess there are days where you have good ones, you have bad ones, and I just want to go out on the top the right way. And I'm not saying I'm going to, or I'll never talk about mob content again, but it's something that I've explored. We'll see.
You alluded to your recent conversation with Gene Borello. That interview has gotten a lot of attention. It sparked a lot of discussion online and elsewhere. Tell folks who may not be familiar, who's Gene Borello?
So Gene Borello is a guy who grew up in Howard Beach, Queens. He's the nephew of Fat Andy Ruggiano. He was connected to Vinny Asaro, who was a Bonanno captain, longtime Bonanno captain. And Vinny Asaro's nephew, Ronnie Gialonzo, also was a captain. They kind of took Gene under their wing. And Gene was out there ripping and running, doing what he had to do to collect. He was this young kind of associate. Did some things that he shouldn't do, and eventually got caught up and became an informant and started podcasting. And, him and I have had some back and forth over the years. It hasn't always been good. Gene is a guy who has went back to prison for some of his behavior. He is a guy who doesn't seem to have much of control over himself, and him and I get into it on a time-to-time basis.
Why did you take the recent interview that you had with him down?
Well, I think, Frank, sometimes you get involved in the heat of the moment and things are said that I don't want out there. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, my channel is monetized. I can't lose certain features that I have. And Gene made some comments of words you can't say on YouTube. And for me, I kind of looked at it and said, I can't let this affect the channel. Gene was also intoxicated during the interview. I didn't know that. He said some things that I didn't exactly think were good. And I made the decision to pull it down. The right people saw it. I mean, everybody was talking about it. It was something I had to do. I didn't want to deal with some of the blowback I would have gotten from some of the things Gene said. And Gene also made some comments about family members of mine, and it just got a little out of hand.
Gotcha. Hey, have you faced any issues with YouTube censorship? That's something YouTube's been criticized from time to time. I'm wondering if you've dealt with that at all.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that I kind of get tired of, having to constantly, you'll work for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on a video, and then they'll say, well, we can't monetize it because of something you said, and there's no real reason. YouTube can just take a channel and shut you down for no reason. And it gets frustrating, but it's all platforms. It's not just YouTube. It's, TikTok, it's Twitter. It's just how it goes. But yeah, I've had many videos not monetized, and a lot of it will have to do with, and a lot of the time they'll not monetize you, and then you'll appeal it, and they'll give you 24 hours later monetization. And by that point, most of your views have already happened, so you don't get paid for anything. So, yeah, it's a challenge. It's irritating, and it's frustrating for sure.
Because it seems like, and who knows what's true, but they say younger people in survey after survey, the number one thing that they aspire to be is no longer an astronaut or president of the United States. They want to be a new media creator, a content creator. If you were giving advice, whether they're for a young person or even an older person that's looking to do this, what would you tell them about this? Is this still a field where it's possible to make a living doing this full time?
I don't think. I mean, I think if you're someone like myself, I mean, I guess I could make a living doing it. But I mean, I've been doing content since 2009, over 15 years, and I'm still not at the point I want to be. Mm-hmm. So it takes a lot, and everybody's doing it. If everybody could do it, there'd be a lot of rich people. And right. I think there are definitely people that are talented and they have a way for themselves. But if you don't have any sort of idea of what you're going to talk about, you just think, I'll just go on and talk and people will listen, That's not really how it works. I would instruct people if you want to get into this, start small, find something you want to talk about and something that will make you money. Doing stuff like, eating on camera, like fun stuff that you can always have content doing. I can't always have content on the mafia.
Same.
I have to always constantly think about stuff.
It's so funny that you mentioned the eating on camera, because a close friend of mine, she, I don't want to get into how I know her, but, she was a professional person that, was involved in the radio business with many years ago. And basically she goes on TikTok and starts making these videos of her eating and doing fart noises as a lark. And now she's making more money from these TikTok videos than she ever did working in radio. I mean, and significantly more. And so to your point, you're exactly right. That's never something that I would have thought to recommend to somebody, but that's very sound financial advice.
I think one of the newer things that I'm seeing, like on a TikTok, and look, I've had success on TikTok probably more than any other platform, is, like people that'll just every week they go to Crumble Cookies and they buy the Crumble cookies that week and they eat them on camera. I don't, or they'll just eat fast food. I don't understand it. But I look at it and I say, why didn't I think of that?
Right.
What I do is challenging. I have to deal with a lot of nonsense. I have to deal with a lot of crap. And I often think like, damn, I wish I would have just, and that's another reason I kind of want to get into other things. I want to talk about true crime. I want to do more things in my personal life. I want to play poker again. I want to go out and, and do things I want to do again. And this is a lot of work. There's a lot of things that go into it. And there's a lot of people that you have to answer to that you don't think you have to answer to.
So let's talk about the criticism from the public, right? I'm sure when you do an interview, you get inevitably, because I get it on almost a daily basis, you get criticism from people that you didn't ask the right questions. You have a guest on, maybe even someone that's kind of controversial, and then you'll have folks that say, hey, I can't believe you didn't ask about this, or you let them off too easy on that. Is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the Gene Borello thing. I mean, I've had people say that I don't ask the right questions. I don't ask tough questions to mobsters. And then I ask tough questions to mobsters and they say, well, you were too hard on him or you poked the bear or whatever. And it's not just that. It's, some of the people you talked about at the beginning of the show. If I do a show, I got to worry about what they're going to say about me because they don't agree with it or they don't believe it or it doesn't fit their wheelhouse. So, yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing with social media. And that's why if you're going to delve into it, you're never going to make people happy. No one. I've dealt with some really nice people in this genre, and even they get the hate from people. So you constantly are dealing with negativity. You're constantly dealing with name calling, and I don't like this, I don't like that. It gets old after a while. But I think as long as you put out a good product, in the end, that a lot of the time works.
One of the very interesting videos you put out recently was from an old school gangster by the name of Hoboken Joe Stassi. I've had some great conversations with my buddy Richard Stratton, who I don't know if you've interviewed, but would make a great guest for you, about his experiences with Joe Stassi. And it's something, this is a name that you don't often hear a great deal about these days, which was one of the reasons I was so glad to see your video. Tell folks who Joe Stassi was.
Yeah, I get the question all the time, who are you most interested in, fascinated by when it comes to the mob? And, Joe Stassi is a guy who, you're never going to hear about, with the Vito Genoveses or the Carlo Gambinos. But Stassi was a guy who goes back to the 20s. He was involved with some big pieces of work. He was kind of on the forefront of gambling in Cuba. He lost most of his worth as far as legal or illegal money in Cuba when Castro took over. He then resorted to being one of the bigger drug traffickers in the history of the American mob, selling heroin, and he got caught up, did 30 years, and died at the age of 96 in 2002. And he's just a guy who was kind of a mover and a shaker. He had the respect of Meyer Lansky and Longy's Willman and Lucky Luciano and all these people. And no one ever really knew what family he belonged to. They said he was a Gambino, but the answer to the Genovese, he was just kind of an enigma that kind of moved throughout New York and New Jersey and made a lot of money. And people said that when he was on the streets, there was no more cold-blooded killer on the street than him. He had more bodies than Murder Inc. I mean, this is a guy who was very feared, very powerful, and you probably never even heard his name until I mentioned it.
Yeah, no, and again, hearing Richard Stratton talk about him, even when he was an old man towards the end of his life, Richard says that he was still just so incredibly intimidating. He didn't lose that ability to inspire fear, even when he was just a couple of years away from death.
Can I curse on your program?
Yeah, go ahead. It's a podcast. We can bleep it if we play it on the radio.
There's when you say like the old age, there was a guy from the Colombo crime family, Charles Panarella, and I remember hearing about when he was in his 80s. He went to a sit down between the Genovese and Colombo families, and Jackie DeRoss was on the street still at that time, and he said, Panarella would chop your fucking head off. So they still fear him, and he's in his 80s, 85 years old. Some of these old guys, they still wield a bunch of power. And I think a guy like that, I think to myself, a guy that was born in 1906, the things that he saw, how many people, how many people saw his face as the last face, they ever saw, how much money did he make? How much money did he lose? It's just fascinating. But yeah, those old guys, that's why we say the mafia is interesting, because if you saw some of these guys on the street, you would never think twice. They just look like your grandpa or something. It ain't like that.
It's funny. Oscar Goodman actually had Charlie Panarella to City Hall when he was mayor of Las Vegas, and he said he was just as intimidating in his 90s as he was in his 50s. So that's for sure. Hey, you mentioned Joey Merlino earlier. Joey Merlino's name gets mentioned a lot these days, especially related to the Philadelphia mob. Who's Joey Merlino, and why do we hear his name so often?
Joey Merlino is a guy who, at least for the last 30 or so years, has been the reputed boss of the Philly mob. He's a guy whose father was the underboss to Nicky Scarfo back in the 70s and 80s. Joey came up, in South Philly. Joey came up as kind of something called a young Turk. He was a guy who did some prison time for an armored car robbery in the late 80s, early 90s. He kind of plotted behind the prison walls and realized that in the early 90s, there was a power vacuum at the top of the Philly mob. His father, Nicky Scarfo, all these people went away, and Joey recognized that he and his friends, who were all kind of native sons of South Philly and had connections way back, maybe they could take over the family. And they went to war with a guy called John Stanfa, who was an old Sicilian. They ended up kind of winning it in the end. Stanfa got life, and Joey, over the last 30 years, has, alongside some of his friends, taken over the mantle. Now, Joey did nearly 15 years up until 2011, came out, assumed the position again from Florida, went back again in 2016, assumed the position again, and now Joey Merlino has a podcast.
Well, that's what's so amazing to me. Yeah. If what you're saying is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt that it is, you don't usually hear about incumbent crime bosses having podcasts. I mean, the mafia is still supposed to be a secret society, right?
Sure. And this is one of the issues that Joey runs into. But in 2024, he looks at it as, I remember when I was a kid, 1996, Joey came on the radio, and he was the boss at that point. And there was a rumor that he had a relationship with a player that played on the Flyers, and he was getting gambling information from this guy, and he called into the radio station. A lot of people would say this is just Joey being Joey. This is what he does. Joey doesn't care what New York thinks. Joey doesn't care what some old guy in Brooklyn thinks. Joey marches to the beat of his own drum, and he'll tell you he has no idea what the mafia is. He has no connection to it. But the people that know and need to know. But he's also a guy that wears designer clothes. He hangs out with celebrities. He reminds me a lot of Joe Gallo back in the day. Now the difference is Joey Gallo is was whacked in the early 70s, and the mafia actually cared about what he was doing. The mafia has no clout, at least in Philadelphia, at least to Joey Merlino, and Joey doesn't care, so he does what he wants.
You did a video recently about how Joey Merlino's driver may have tried to frame him. What was that all about?
Yeah, so back in the early 90s, Joey, when he got out of prison for an armored car robbery, he had a bunch of sycophants around him. Still does. I mean, he has many of them. Guys that worship him. They'll do whatever he says. They want to be around him. And he had a driver, Roger Vela, young kid that was selling a lot of drugs. Roger was a crazy kid. They called him Crazy Roger. He lived on a little street in South Philly and with his family. He was selling a lot of cocaine, a lot of heroin, and he got involved with a rival. The rival, tied up his family, beat him with guns, and he took it as a slight, obviously. He then lured the guy to his house and whacked him. And he tried to get Joey involved with, he said Joey told him to do it, and Joey's friends helped him move the body down to the stadium area, and they set it on fire, and he tried to include everybody. And that's the kind of the thing about Joey. People only say his name when they get arrested. I know Joey, and he helped me do this, or he told me to do this. And, Vela tried to frame him. The problem was Vela wasn't believable. The feds never buyed anything he said. They put him on the stand, tried to put him on the stand. He lied multiple times. And he was just another person you can add to the list that tried to either frame or involve Joey.
What case did they put him on the stand in?
Well, they were going to put him on the stand in Joey's racketeering case. The problem was before they were going to put him on the stand, he had mentioned at one point he was a made member of the mafia. And then like 2 days later, he's like, well, I was just kidding. I'm not actually a made member of the mafia. And he didn't end up testifying because, again, they couldn't put him on the stand. He did ultimately testify against a black drug dealer, Trent Picard, in Philadelphia for a couple of murders that Picard told him about in prison. And Trent Picard is serving life in Pennsylvania State Prison for it. But, Vela's a guy who, would end up cooperating, and he's living somewhere in America. And he's another guy who reoffended as a cooperator. And, that's kind of the thing that they dangle in front of Joey's people. Tell us about Joey. Tell us about murders that Joey committed, and we'll get you out of this. And a lot of the time it doesn't work, but I think Joey has sleepless nights worrying about, will someone ever that is believable step up and screw me?
Jeff, you are really one of the leaders in the new media and the way that the new media covers crime, especially of the organized variety. It used to be everybody would look forward to the daily newspaper in the morning to find out what was going on. And if you wanted to know about mob cases, you would look forward to Jerry Capisa's weekly column in the New York Daily News, one or two other print columnists as well that had a lot of reach in that in certain eras. I'm wondering, now that anybody that wants one can have a podcast just by talking into their phone, and now that anyone that wants to call themselves a journalist can just tweet about crime issues, how do you think the new media, the internet, podcasting, all that sort of thing, has affected the way crime is being covered? Are we learning more about the truth of what's actually happening in terms of what's on the street, or are we seeing a lot more inaccurate information that hasn't necessarily moved the ball forward in terms of the public being more informed?
I think you're definitely seeing more of the inaccuracies. I mean, I'm fascinated by what we see from, just anybody when the mafia comes up. I remember when John Gotti III fought Floyd Mayweather. And a lot of people were talking about, is Floyd Mayweather going to get whacked because he won the fight? People are just so uninformed on what the mob is, and they think it's one thing, and it's, 25 years later, it's way different. But I think one thing that I would just say is that you have to find people that have always kind of stood there and were able to provide good context, good info, and generally they'll be the ones you want to look for. But no, I don't think it's helped. I mean, it's not easy to do a podcast, as you know. It's not easy to find a guest or to do a show. And there are people that try, but they'll either lose interest because no one will watch it and they'll get discouraged, or, they'll be, someone will say, hey, you need to stop doing this, and they'll stop doing it. You have to have a strong will, I think, to keep going and doing it. there are days where I hate this stuff. I hate doing it. I don't want to do it. And then something big will happen and it'll be like, wow, I can't believe that happened. I'm glad I'm here for it, But I would strongly advise getting into the space that I'm in. I would strongly advise against it. Go make the real money where you can eat on camera or, or play video games.
Exactly. Hey, Jeff Nadu, if you want to check him out, be sure to subscribe to the Sitdown in all of its forms. Jeff, it's always a treat to talk with you. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Frank. I always look forward to chatting with you as well. And, it looks like a very interesting week is wrapped up with the RNC. I guess now we'll have to wonder who the DNC candidate might be.
Any guesses?
I tweeted. I have a feeling it's Michelle Obama, but then I feel like it just, I don't know, maybe too short of notice. But I don't think anyone's going to beat Trump at this point. I think he'd be hard pressed. I know it won't be Biden. I would have said Michelle Obama, but I think it's probably going to be Kamala Harris, and I think Kamala is going to have probably a worse time than Biden would have.
It's going to be very interesting, that's for sure. All right, check out Jeff Nadu on The Sitdown. Meantime, if you want to share any of your thoughts on this podcast, you're welcome to email me. You can do so at frank.morano, that's frank.morano, at wabcradio.com. If somebody sent you this podcast, please be so good as to subscribe. Just search The Racket Report in any podcast app. And please be so kind as to share this with a friend. Until we meet again in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.